Welcome to Mr. Night Scare, where the shadows come alive and the stories will keep you up at night. Sit back, turn off the lights, and prepare for a journey into the eerie and unexplained. It's every teenager's dream, a house to yourself, no rules, and complete freedom. But for Emma, one seemingly peaceful evening turned into her worst nightmare. A stalker, strange sounds, and a chilling twist left her questioning if she'd ever feel safe again. What really happened that night? This is her story. It was a quiet Friday night in the suburbs. The street was unusually still, with most of the neighbors away for the weekend. 16-year-old Emma had begged her parents to let her stay home while they went on their anniversary trip. She assured them she was responsible enough to handle being alone. The house felt emptier than usual as Emma lounged on the couch, scrolling through her phone. A bowl of popcorn sat on the table beside her. She texted her best friend Lily. "Finally, no parents for the whole weekend. Want to FaceTime?" Lily responded almost immediately. "Lucky you. I'm stuck babysitting. Call me if you get scared, haha." Emma laughed. "Scared? Please. It's just me and Netflix tonight." The clock struck 9 p.m. Emma locked the doors, turned off the porch light, and dimmed the living room lamps, creating a cozy atmosphere. She started a horror movie marathon, relishing the peace and quiet. But little did she know, her peaceful night was about to spiral into chaos. The first hour went by uneventfully. Emma was halfway through her second movie when she heard a soft thud from the backyard. She paused the movie and sat up, heart racing slightly. "It's probably just the wind," she told herself. The autumn breeze had been strong that evening. She got up to check the back door, peeking through the curtain. Nothing. She locked the door again, just in case, and returned to the couch. But as she settled in, her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You're alone, aren't you?" Emma's heart skipped a beat. She stared at the screen, unsure whether to respond. Finally, she typed, "Who is this?" The reply came instantly. "Someone who's watching." She froze, her eyes darting around the room. Every shadow suddenly seemed menacing. Emma called Lily. "Lily, someone just texted me something really creepy." "It's probably just a prank," Lily said, trying to reassure her. "Do you want me to come over?" Before Emma could answer, the landline phone in the kitchen rang. She didn't even know the landline still worked. "Hold on, Lily," Emma said, switching over to the landline. "Hello?" she answered cautiously. A low, distorted voice whispered, "I'm closer than you think." Emma slammed the phone down and ran to the kitchen window. The backyard was empty, but the eerie silence felt oppressive. Emma double-checked all the locks on the doors and windows, her heart pounding. She grabbed a kitchen knife and kept her phone close. Trying to calm down, she texted Lily, "I'm really freaking out. I think someone's outside." "Lily, stay calm. Call the police." Before Emma could dial, the power suddenly went out. The house plunged into darkness, and Emma's phone flashlight became her only source of light. That's when she heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the back porch. She froze, gripping the knife tightly. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then came the sound of the back door handle jiggling. "Who's there?" Emma shouted, her voice trembling. The handle stopped moving. Silence, and then bang. The sound of someone pounding on the back door made her jump. Emma ran upstairs, barricading herself in her bedroom. She texted Lily again. "They're trying to get in. What do I do?" "Lily, hide. I'm calling the police for you." Emma hid in her closet, trying to muffle her breathing. From her hiding spot, she could hear the faint creak of the front door opening. Someone was inside the house. Emma stayed perfectly still, her heart hammering in her chest. She peeked through the slats of the closet door and saw a tall man in a dark hoodie slowly walking into her room. He moved with purpose, scanning the room. Emma held her breath, clutching the knife so tightly her knuckles turned white. The man opened drawers, checked under the bed, and then stood in front of the closet. Emma's entire body froze as he reached for the door handle. But before he could open it, the sound of sirens blared in the distance. The man stiffened, then quickly left the room. Emma waited until she heard the sound of the front door slamming shut. She bolted out of the closet and ran downstairs. The police arrived minutes later. Emma ran out to meet them, shaking and tearful. She explained everything that had happened, from the creepy texts to the intruder entering the house. The officers searched the property but found no sign of the man. However, what they discovered in the basement sent chills down everyone's spines. Hidden behind a false wall was a small room filled with surveillance equipment. Cameras had been installed throughout the house, tiny, almost invisible. They had been recording Emma's every move for weeks. The police also found a notebook filled with disturbing entries. Each page detailed Emma's daily activities. Friday 9 p.m., watching movies. Sitting on the couch, alone. Emma realized with horror that the stalker had been planning this for a long time. As the officers escorted her to safety, Emma glanced back at the house one last time. In the shadows of the tree line, she saw him, a tall figure in a hoodie, watching her. Emma moved away shortly after that night, but the stalker was never caught. And to this day she still wonders, was he watching her before she even knew it? And who might he be watching now? It was a weekend like any other, or so Alex thought. He and his girlfriend, Emma, had planned a quiet night together at his family's remote countryside home. Nestled deep in the woods, the house was isolated, surrounded by tall trees and endless shadows. For Alex, it was the perfect opportunity to spend some quality time with Emma, away from the noise and distractions of the city. What he didn't know was that this night would haunt them both forever. The evening began innocently enough. They cooked dinner together, laughed over inside jokes, and sat by the fireplace sharing stories. But as the night deepened, an unsettling stillness enveloped the house. The kind of silence that made every creak of the old wooden floors echo like a scream. The couple shrugged it off, attributing it to their imaginations. But as they would soon discover, something far more sinister lurked in the shadows. The house had a history. Alex's grandparents had built it decades ago, and it had remained in the family ever since. But the locals spoke in hushed tones about the land it was built on. Rumors of strange disappearances and whispers in the woods had persisted for years. Alex had always dismissed these stories as superstitions, but Emma wasn't so sure. As they unpacked for the weekend, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. "Are you sure about this place?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with unease. "It's just an old house," Alex replied with a smile. "Nothing to worry about." Still, Emma's eyes lingered on the darkened corners of the living room, where the light from the fireplace didn't quite reach. It started just after midnight. They were watching a horror movie, curled up on the couch when they heard it, a faint knock at the front door. Alex paused the movie and looked at Emma, who froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Yeah, probably the wind," Alex said, though his voice betrayed his doubt. The knock came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate taps. Alex got up, his heart pounding, and approached the door. He peered through the peephole but saw nothing, just the inky blackness of the night. Hesitating for a moment, he opened the door slightly and peeked outside. The porch was empty. "No one's there," he said, shutting the door and locking it. But Emma noticed the tension in his shoulders as he returned to the couch. The knocks didn't return, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Emma suggested going to bed, hoping sleep would chase away the tension. They went upstairs to the master bedroom and locked the door. As they lay in bed, the house seemed to come alive. The floorboards creaked as if someone was walking down the hallway. The sound of faint whispers drifted through the walls, too quiet to make out. "Do you hear that?" Emma asked, clutching Alex's arm. "It's an old house. It makes noises," Alex said, though he couldn't explain the whispers. Then Emma gasped. She pointed to the window. A shadow moved outside, just beyond the glass. Alex jumped out of bed and yanked the curtains closed. "Probably an animal," he muttered, trying to convince himself as much as Emma. But Emma wasn't buying it. "That was not an animal, Alex. That was a person." Unable to sleep, Alex decided to check the house. He grabbed a flashlight and went downstairs, leaving Emma in the bedroom with a heavy wooden bat for protection. As he searched the ground floor, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be coming from below, the basement. Alex hesitated at the top of the basement stairs. The door was slightly ajar, and the darkness below seemed to swallow the light from his flashlight. Taking a deep breath, he descended the creaky wooden steps. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers became more distinct. It was as if multiple voices were speaking at once, their words overlapping in a chaotic symphony. When he reached the bottom, his flashlight flickered. He swung it around, illuminating the old furniture and forgotten boxes. Then he saw it, a figure standing in the corner, facing the wall. It was still, unnaturally still, as if it were a statue. "Who's there?" Alex demanded, his voice trembling. The figure slowly turned its head. Its face was pale, with hollow black eyes that seemed to pierce through him. Alex stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. The basement was plunged into darkness. He scrambled up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind him. Alex burst into the bedroom, his face pale and his hands shaking. "We need to leave. Now." Emma didn't argue. She grabbed her phone and the bat, and they made their way downstairs. As they reached the front door, they heard a loud crash from the kitchen. Something, or someone, was in the house. They sprinted to the car, not daring to look back. Alex fumbled with the keys, finally starting the engine. As they drove away, Emma glanced in the rearview mirror. The shadowy figure stood on the porch, watching them. But it wasn't alone. More figures emerged from the woods, their hollow eyes glowing in the darkness. Alex and Emma never returned to the house. They tried to forget that night, but the whispers followed them. Late at night, when the world was silent, they would hear faint taps on their windows. And in the shadows, they always felt eyes watching. The house still stands, its secrets buried deep within its walls. But the question remains, who or what was watching Alex and Emma that night? And why did it let them go? Perhaps some stories are better left untold. The suburban neighborhood was always quiet, especially during the colder months when families preferred to stay indoors. Jack, a 20-year-old college student, was looking forward to a weekend of solitude. His parents were visiting relatives for the weekend, leaving Jack in charge of the house. It was a responsibility he didn't mind. He'd have the house to himself, free to play games, binge movies, and enjoy some peace and quiet. But things took an unexpected turn when his neighbor, Evelyn, knocked on his door that evening. Evelyn was in her early 30s, with a mysterious air about her. She lived alone in the house next door, keeping to herself most of the time. Jack rarely saw her, and when he did, she was either tending to her garden or heading to her car, always avoiding small talk. That night, Evelyn's knock set off a chain of events that would plunge Jack into a nightmare he couldn't escape. It was around 8 p.m. when Jack heard the knock. The house was eerily quiet, with only the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the air. Curious, he opened the door to find Evelyn standing there, clutching a flashlight. Her expression was tense. "Jack," she began, her voice soft but urgent. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I think someone is trying to break into my house. Could you come take a look?" Jack hesitated. He wasn't exactly the hero type, but he couldn't just turn her away. Sure, let me grab my phone," he said, stepping back inside to retrieve it. As he followed Evelyn to her house, the unease in her voice lingered in his mind. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, and the cold wind rustled the bare branches of the trees. Something about the night felt off, as though the shadows themselves were watching. Evelyn's house was completely dark. She explained that her power had gone out about an hour ago, which only heightened her fear. Jack's phone flashlight illuminated the living room as they stepped inside. The place was neat but sparsely decorated, with an air of emptiness that made Jack's skin crawl. "I heard noises upstairs," Evelyn whispered, her eyes darting toward the staircase. "Footsteps. But when I checked, there was no one there." Jack swallowed hard. "Okay, let's take a look." They climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under their weight. At the top, Jack shone his light down the hallway. The doors to the bedrooms were all closed. He opened each one cautiously, finding nothing but neatly made beds and empty closets. When they reached the last door, Evelyn grabbed his arm. "This one," she said, her voice trembling. "I heard the noise coming from here." Jack turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the corner. But as he scanned the room, his light caught something that made his blood run cold. Muddy footprints leading from the window to the door. "Evelyn," he whispered, "someone's been here." Before they could react, a loud bang echoed from downstairs. Evelyn stifled a scream as Jack quickly turned off the flashlight. They stood in the dark, listening. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the house, growing louder with each passing second. "We need to get out of here," Jack whispered. Evelyn nodded, and they began to creep toward the stairs. But as they reached the top step, the footsteps stopped. The house fell into an unsettling silence. "Jack," Evelyn whispered, barely audible. "What if they're waiting for us?" Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He strained his ears, trying to detect any sound. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement in the living room below. A figure stood near the window, silhouetted against the faint glow of the streetlights. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. "Back upstairs," Jack whispered, pulling Evelyn toward the hallway. They ducked into the nearest bedroom and locked the door. Jack pressed his ear to the door, listening intently. After a moment, the sound of footsteps resumed, this time heading up the stairs. Jack's mind raced. They were trapped, and whoever was in the house was closing in. He scanned the room for anything they could use to defend themselves. His eyes landed on a heavy lamp on the nightstand. "Take this," he whispered, handing it to Evelyn. "If they come in, hit them with everything you've got." Evelyn's hands trembled as she gripped the lamp. Jack picked up a metal rod from the closet and positioned himself near the door. The footsteps stopped just outside. The doorknob rattled. "Who's there?" Jack demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. There was no response. Instead, the door shuddered as if someone were throwing their weight against it. Evelyn let out a muffled sob, and Jack tightened his grip on the rod. Just as the door seemed ready to give way, the sound of sirens pierced the air. The banging stopped. Heavy footsteps retreated down the stairs, and the front door slammed shut. When the police arrived, they searched the house but found no sign of the intruder. The muddy footprints led to the woods behind Evelyn's home, but disappeared among the trees. The officers assured them they'd patrol the area, but couldn't promise much else. Jack stayed with Evelyn that night, too shaken to return home. They barricaded themselves in the living room, keeping the lights on until morning. Neither of them slept. In the days that followed, strange things continued to happen. Evelyn found her garden tools rearranged, and Jack discovered scratches on the fence separating their properties. It became clear that whoever had entered her house that night wasn't finished with them. Part 6. The Final Confrontation. A week later, Evelyn called Jack in a panic. "He's back," she said, her voice trembling. "I saw him in the backyard." Jack grabbed a flashlight and hurried over. Together, they searched the property, but found no sign of the man. Just as they were about to give up, they heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the basement window. Jack and Evelyn exchanged a terrified glance. Gathering their courage, they descended into the basement. The air was damp and cold, and the single light bulb cast eerie shadows on the walls. As they reached the bottom step, the tapping stopped. "Hello?" Jack called out, his voice echoing in the confined space. Suddenly, the light bulb flickered and went out. In the darkness, they heard the sound of breathing, low and raspy. Jack swung the flashlight around, its beam cutting through the blackness. The light landed on a figure crouched in the corner, its face pale and eyes gleaming with malice. The intruder lunged at them, and Jack swung the flashlight with all his might. The man stumbled back, giving them just enough time to run upstairs and lock the basement door. They called the police, who arrived moments later. This time, they caught the man, a drifter who had been living in the crawl space beneath Evelyn's house. The drifter was arrested, but the trauma lingered. Jack and Evelyn grew closer in the aftermath, finding comfort in each other's company. They couldn't shake the feeling that their quiet neighborhood would never feel safe again. To this day, Jack avoids staying home alone, especially at night, and every now and then, when the wind rattles the windows or a shadow shifts unexpectedly, he remembers the pale face in the basement and wonders if true evil ever really goes away. The weekend was supposed to be uneventful. Kyle, a reserved 18-year-old, had no problem being left home alone for the weekend, while his dad and stepmom went out of town. But there was a catch this time. His 16-year-old stepsister, Mia, would be staying with him. Their relationship wasn't exactly close. Mia was lively and outspoken, the complete opposite of Kyle. But this wasn't going to be a problem. They'd keep to their separate spaces, and the weekend would pass without incident. At least, that's what Kyle thought. The house was a modern, spacious home located on the edge of the woods, a place where silence came naturally. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the isolation of the house became more pronounced. What started as a quiet night of streaming movies and scrolling through phones quickly took a turn neither Kyle nor Mia could have ever imagined. It was late on Friday evening, and a thunderstorm had rolled in. Rain lashed against the windows, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the living room where Kyle and Mia sat. They had decided to watch a horror movie to pass the time. The irony of watching something scary while alone in a house on a stormy night wasn't lost on them. Halfway through the movie, Mia nudged Kyle. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Kyle paused the movie, annoyed. "See what?" "Out there, by the tree line. I thought I saw someone," she said, her voice tinged with unease. She pointed to the large glass sliding door that led to the backyard. Kyle sighed and got up, peering outside. The storm made it difficult to see anything beyond the deck. "It's just the rain messing with the light," he said, brushing off her concern. But as he returned to his seat, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had moved out there. Something too big to be an animal. As the movie's climax approached, the screen suddenly went dark. The hum of electricity ceased, and the house was plunged into silence, save for the pounding rain. "Great," Kyle muttered, reaching for his phone to use as a flashlight. "Power's out." "Do we have candles or something?" Mia asked, already pulling her knees to her chest. Kyle nodded. "Yeah, in the kitchen. Stay here. I'll grab them." Using his phone's light, Kyle navigated through the dark house. The storm outside made the atmosphere feel oppressive, each creak of the floorboards amplified in the silence. As he opened the kitchen drawer to retrieve the candles, he heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the front door. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The tapping came again, louder this time. Summoning his courage, he crept to the front door and looked through the peephole. There was nothing there. Kyle returned to the living room with the candles, trying to act as if everything was normal. He didn't want to scare Mia, who was already on edge. He lit a couple of candles and placed them on the coffee table. "Hear anything weird while I was gone?" he asked casually. Mia hesitated. "I thought I heard footsteps upstairs, but I'm probably imagining things." Kyle laughed nervously. "Yeah, must be the house settling." But deep down, he knew better. The house was new. There was no reason for it to creak like an old haunted mansion. He glanced toward the staircase, the shadows dancing at the edge of the candlelight. For a moment, he thought he saw something move at the top of the stairs. He blinked, and it was gone. As the night wore on, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Mia suggested they sleep in the living room together, where the light from the candles made the darkness feel less oppressive. Kyle agreed, fetching blankets from upstairs. While grabbing the blankets from the linen closet, he noticed something odd. The door to the guest bedroom at the end of the hall was slightly open. It was strange because no one used that room. His dad had locked it months ago, saying it was for storage. But now, the door was ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Kyle approached the door cautiously. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence. He pushed the door open wider, the hinges creaking. The flashlight beam from his phone illuminated the room. It was empty, just as it had been the last time he saw it. But as he turned to leave, he noticed something chilling, muddy footprints on the floor, leading from the window to the door. Kyle rushed back downstairs, his heart racing. He decided not to tell Mia about the footprints. She was already scared enough. Instead, he locked all the doors and windows, double-checking each one. But no matter how secure the house felt, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. At around 3 a.m., Mia nudged him awake. "Kyle, someone's outside," she whispered, her voice trembling. Kyle sat up, his eyes darting to the sliding glass door. In the dim light of the candles, he saw a figure standing just beyond the glass. It was a man, tall and motionless, with his face obscured by the shadows. Kyle's breath caught in his throat as the man slowly raised a hand and tapped on the glass. Mia let out a muffled scream, and Kyle grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, holding it like a weapon. "Who are you? What do you want?" he shouted. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head as if studying them. Then, without warning, it turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. Morning finally came, bringing a sense of relief. The storm had passed and sunlight streamed through the windows. Kyle and Mia decided to leave the house and stay at a friend's place for the rest of the weekend. But as they packed their bags, Mia found something that made her blood run cold. On the coffee table, where the candles had burned through the night, was a note written in smudged ink. It read, "I'll see you again soon." Kyle's mind raced. How had someone gotten inside? They had locked all the doors and windows, and then it hit him. The guest bedroom, the footprints, the window. Someone had been in the house with them the entire night. Kyle and Mia never stayed at the house again. The police found no signs of forced entry, and the footprints in the guest room had been wiped away by the time they arrived. But Kyle and Mia knew the truth. They weren't imagining things. Someone, or something, had been watching them, waiting in the shadows. And the worst part? It wasn't over. The note promised that much. To this day, Kyle and Mia can't explain what happened that weekend. But every now and then, when the wind howls and the rain falls, they swear they hear faint tapping at the windows, as if someone is trying to get back in. The ocean was a constant in Clara's life. Growing up in the coastal town of Blackwater Bay, she found solace in the rhythmic crash of waves, the salty tang in the air, and the endless stretch of horizon. But Blackwater Bay had its shadows, stories of shipwrecks, disappearances, and the drowned ones, restless souls said to haunt the waters near Raven's Cove. Clara never believed the tales. She was too practical for ghost stories. Until the summer she returned home. Clara, her younger brother Jake, and 3 of their closest friends decided to spend a weekend camping near Raven's Cove. It was a secluded spot with white sands, towering cliffs, and a reputation for danger. The locals avoided it, citing treacherous tides and whispered legends. But for Clara and her friends, it was the perfect escape from reality. By the time the weekend was over, Clara would wish she'd never set foot on that cursed beach. The drive to Raven's Cove was uneventful, but the air seemed heavier as they approached. Clara sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as Jake navigated the winding coastal road. Behind them, Mia, her best friend, was joking with Sam and Leo, the twins they'd known since childhood. "So what's the deal with this place again?" Leo asked, leaning forward. "Something about ghosts?" Mia snorted. "Supposedly, the drowned ones haunt the cove. They lure people into the water and drag them down. Typical spooky nonsense." Jake grinned. "You mean to tell me you're not scared, Mia? Not even a little?" "Not even a little," Mia shot back, though her tone was less confident than she'd intended. Clara, however, felt a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. As they rounded the final bend, the cove came into view. It was stunning. Pristine sand framed by jagged cliffs, the waves sparkling under the late afternoon sun. But there was something off about it. The shadows of the cliffs seemed too long, the water darker than it should have been. "Let's set up camp," Clara said, trying to shake off the feeling. "We've got a long night ahead." By sunset, the tents were pitched and a fire crackled in the center of their makeshift campsite. The group sat in a circle, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. As the sky darkened, the conversation turned to the legend of the drowned ones. "The story goes," Sam began, "that a ship sank off the coast centuries ago. The crew tried to swim to shore, but the sea was too rough. They drowned, cursing the waters as they went under. Now they're stuck here, looking for people to join them." "Why would they stay here?" Jake asked, tossing a stick into the fire. "Because they're bound to the place where they died," Mia explained. "Their spirits can't move on, or so the legend says." "It's all nonsense," Clara said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Just a story to keep people from swimming near the rocks." But as the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of decay, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. That night, Clara woke to the sound of whispering. She sat up, heart pounding, and looked around the tent. Jake was sound asleep beside her, snoring softly. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices rising and falling in an eerie melody. Clara unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, and the beach was bathed in pale moonlight. The whispering seemed to come from the water, where faint figures moved just beyond the surf. "Hello?" Clara called out, her voice trembling. The figures froze. For a moment, all was silent. Then one of them stepped forward, its form shimmering like a mirage. It raised an arm, pointing directly at Clara. She stumbled backward, tripping over a log and landing hard in the sand. When she looked up, the figures were gone. The next morning, Clara told the group what she'd seen. Mia dismissed it as a bad dream, and Jake joked about her overactive imagination. But Sam and Leo seemed uneasy. "I thought I heard something last night too," Sam admitted, "like voices." "Probably the wind," Leo said quickly, though his hands fidgeted with the straps of his backpack. Determined to prove that nothing was amiss, Jake suggested they explore the tide pools near the cliffs. The group reluctantly agreed, but as they walked along the shore, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. When they reached the tide pools, Mia pointed out something strange. The rocks were covered in carvings, symbols and shapes that looked like they belonged in an ancient language. At the center of one pool was a small, weathered statue of a woman with her arms outstretched, as if beckoning someone closer. "This is creepy," Mia said, taking a step back. "Let's go." But Jake was transfixed. "It's just a statue," he said, reaching out to touch it. As his fingers brushed the stone, the water around the statue began to churn. Clara grabbed his arm, pulling him away. "We're leaving. Now." That night, the whispers returned. This time they were louder, more insistent. Clara woke to find Jake standing at the edge of the water, staring out at the sea. "Jake?" she called, her voice trembling. He turned to her, his eyes glassy. "They want me to come," he said. "They need help." Clara ran to him, shaking him out of his trance. But as she led him back to the campsite, she saw them again. The figures in the water, watching, waiting. The next morning, Jake had no memory of what had happened, but the others began experiencing strange occurrences. Mia heard her name whispered in the wind. Sam's flashlight flickered, revealing shadowy shapes that vanished when he turned around. And Leo found handprints in the sand around his tent, though no one had been near him. Desperate to end the nightmare, Clara convinced the group to leave. But as they packed their things, the wind picked up and the waves grew higher. The whispers turned into wails, and the figures emerged from the water, their forms twisted and grotesque. The group ran, but the beach seemed endless. No matter how far they went, they couldn't escape the figures. One by one, the friends were dragged into the surf, their screams swallowed by the ocean. Clara was the last to fall. As cold hands pulled her under, she saw their faces, pale, bloated, and full of despair. The drowned ones. Weeks later, a fisherman found an abandoned campsite near Raven's Cove. The tents were torn, the fire long cold. Among the ruins was a notebook, its pages filled with frantic warnings. "Stay away. They're in the water. They're waiting." But by then it was too late. The drowned ones had found new voices to join their eternal song. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. The small coastal town of Sandhaven was known for its pristine beaches, turquoise waters, and untouched beauty. Tourists often described it as paradise on earth. But like all paradises, Sandhaven had its secrets, ones buried deep beneath the waves, waiting for the right moment to resurface. For 4 college friends, Emma, Lucas, Mia, and Ryan, their trip to Sandhaven started like any other vacation. They'd planned a week of relaxation, bonfires, and late-night swims. None of them could have anticipated the horrors that would unfold when they ventured too close to the infamous Devil's Reef, a stretch of jagged rocks just off the coast. Locals avoided it, calling it cursed, but the friends dismissed the warnings as mere superstition. Their first night in Sandhaven was filled with laughter and the soothing sound of crashing waves. By the end of the week, however, the beach would be silent, save for the whispers of those who never left. The group arrived in Sandhaven on a sunny afternoon. The town was picturesque, with quaint cottages, vibrant fishing boats bobbing in the harbor, and a seemingly endless stretch of golden sand. Their rented beach house sat on a secluded cove, far from the bustling tourist areas. "This place is amazing," Mia said, stepping out onto the deck that overlooked the ocean. "I can't believe we got it for so cheap." "Probably because it's so isolated," Lucas replied, unloading their bags from the car. "But hey, more privacy for us." Emma, always the cautious one, glanced around. "Doesn't it feel a little too quiet, though? Like, unnatural?" Ryan rolled his eyes. "Relax, Em, not everything is a horror movie." Unbeknownst to them, a lone fisherman watched from the cliffs above. His weathered face was grim, and he muttered under his breath, "Fools, they never listen." The first 2 days were uneventful. The group spent their time swimming, sunbathing, and exploring the shoreline. On the 3rd day, they decided to venture into town for supplies. At the local market, an elderly woman approached them. Her eyes were cloudy with cataracts, but her voice was sharp. "You kids staying near Devil's Reef?" Lucas hesitated. Yeah. Why?" The woman's expression darkened. "Stay away from the reef. Bad things happen there. The kind of bad that doesn't let you leave." Emma's curiosity was piqued. "What kind of bad things?" The woman leaned in closer. "They say the reef calls to people, draws them in, and once you go, you don't come back." Ryan chuckled nervously. "Sounds like a ghost story." "It's not a story," the woman snapped. "People have disappeared, tourists like you, and the ones who return, they're not the same." The group left the market with a lingering sense of unease, but Ryan dismissed the warning as nonsense. "Old towns like this always have weird legends," he said. "Let's just enjoy the beach." That night, the group built a bonfire on the beach. The stars were bright and the sound of waves filled the air. As the fire crackled, Lucas suggested a late-night swim. "Are you serious?" Emma asked. "It's freezing." "Come on, it'll be fun," Lucas said, already stripping down to his swim trunks. Ryan and Mia followed suit, leaving Emma reluctantly joining them. The water was colder than expected, and the moonlight cast an eerie glow over the waves. As they splashed around, Mia froze. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "Hear what?" Lucas replied. "It sounded like whispering," Mia said, her voice trembling. Ryan laughed. "It's probably just the wind." But Emma heard it too, a faint, melodic whispering as if the ocean itself was speaking. She turned to look toward the reef and saw something, a shadowy figure standing on the rocks, watching them. When she blinked, it was gone. "We should get out of the water," Emma said, her voice firm. The next morning, Ryan suggested they check out the reef. "It's low tide," he said. "Perfect time to explore." Despite Emma's protests, the group made their way to Devil's Reef. The rocks were slick with algae, and the air smelled of salt and decay. As they climbed, they found strange carvings etched into the stone, symbols and runes that none of them recognized. "What do you think they mean?" Lucas asked. "Nothing good," Emma replied. Near the edge of the reef, they found a tidal pool filled with shimmering water. It was unnaturally clear, and something about it felt wrong. "Dare you to dive in," Ryan said to Lucas. Lucas grinned. "You're on." Before anyone could stop him, Lucas dove into the pool. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the water began to churn violently. Lucas surfaced, gasping for air, but his eyes were wide with terror. "Something's down there," he screamed. The group pulled him out, but Lucas wouldn't stop shaking. "Eyes," he whispered. "So many eyes watching me." After the incident at the reef, Lucas's condition worsened. He became withdrawn, barely speaking, and often stared blankly into space. At night, he muttered in his sleep, his words unintelligible but filled with fear. Meanwhile, the house itself seemed to change. Shadows moved where there shouldn't be any. Doors creaked open on their own, and the sound of whispering grew louder, more insistent. One night, Mia woke up to find Lucas standing at the edge of the water, staring out at the reef. When she called his name, he turned to her, but his eyes weren't his own. They were black, empty voids. "It's calling me," he said. "I have to go." Desperate to break whatever curse had befallen them, the group returned to the reef, hoping to find answers. The symbols on the rocks seemed to glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. "This was a mistake," Emma said. "We need to leave." But it was too late. The water around the reef began to rise, forming tendrils that reached for them. A deafening roar filled the air as a massive, shadowy figure emerged from the ocean. Its form was indistinct, but its glowing eyes bore into them. One by one, the friends were pulled into the water. Emma was the last, fighting with every ounce of strength she had. As she was dragged beneath the waves, she saw the truth. The reef wasn't just cursed. It was alive, feeding on those who dared to disturb it. Weeks later, a new group of tourists arrived in Sandhaven, eager to explore its untouched beauty. As they walked along the beach, they noticed a peculiar sight, a weathered journal washed up on the shore. Inside were the frantic writings of Emma Marks, warning anyone who read them. The island of Marlowe's Haven was a hidden gem, an unspoiled paradise known only to a few adventurous souls. Every summer, tourists flocked to its pristine beaches and turquoise waters, but few stayed past sunset. Locals warned that the nights belonged to the sea and the secrets it held. Visitors laughed off the superstitions, calling them quaint folklore meant to spook outsiders, until someone vanished. This summer, The island was hosting its biggest event yet, the annual Marlow Beach Festival. Among the attendees were college friends Emily, Nate, Rachel, and Kevin, who had planned their trip as a last hurrah before graduation. They arrived ready for sun, sand, and celebration. But by the end of the festival, they would uncover the island's darkest secret. The festival was everything they had hoped for. Stalls lined the beach, offering fresh seafood, vibrant crafts, and colorful drinks served in hollowed-out coconuts. Music played from a makeshift stage, where local bands performed under strings of twinkling lights. Emily, Nate, Rachel, and Kevin wandered through the festivities, soaking in the lively atmosphere. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the mood shifted. The laughter and music continued, but the air grew heavy. A warm breeze carried the faint scent of brine and something else, something metallic and sour. Emily noticed the locals glancing nervously at the water, their smiles faltering. "What's with the long faces?" Kevin joked, nudging an older man selling hand-carved necklaces. The man's expression darkened. "Stay close to the fire tonight," he said, his voice low, "and don't go near the water." Emily frowned. "Why not?" "The ocean isn't always kind," he replied cryptically before turning away. Later that night, the group gathered near the bonfire, sipping drinks and sharing stories with other festival-goers. Kevin, ever the daredevil, decided to spice things up. "All right, how about a little adventure?" he said, standing and gesturing toward the water. "Let's go for a swim." "Are you crazy?" Rachel hissed. "Didn't you hear what that guy said? What, the spooky warning?" Kevin laughed. "It's just a bunch of superstitious nonsense. Come on, it'll be fun." Nate and Emily exchanged uneasy glances, but Kevin was already running toward the shore. With a reluctant sigh, Nate followed. Emily hesitated before trailing after them, leaving Rachel alone by the fire. The water was colder than expected, and the waves seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. Emily waded in cautiously, her feet sinking into the silty bottom. Kevin splashed ahead, laughing and shouting, while Nate floated nearby, staring at the stars. Emily tried to relax, but a sudden tug at her ankle made her yelp. "What's wrong?" Nate called. "Something grabbed me," Emily said, her voice shaky. "Probably just seaweed," Kevin said dismissively. "Don't be such a—" Before he could finish, he was pulled under. For a moment, there was silence. Then Kevin burst to the surface, coughing and thrashing. "Something's down there," he gasped, scrambling toward the shore. The others followed, their fear outweighing their curiosity. They collapsed onto the sand, panting and shivering. Rachel ran over, her face pale. "What happened?" "I don't know," Kevin said, his voice trembling, "but it felt human." Emily glanced back at the water, now eerily calm. She thought she saw something, a pale face just beneath the surface, but when she blinked, it was gone. The group returned to their tent, but sleep didn't come easily. Kevin's bravado had vanished, replaced by a nervous energy that made him jump at every sound. Nate suggested they leave in the morning, but Emily wasn't so sure. She needed answers. The next day, she approached one of the locals, an elderly woman selling shells. "What's out there?" Emily asked, gesturing to the ocean. The woman's eyes narrowed. "You saw them, didn't you?" "Saw who?" "The Whispers," she said. "They're the souls of sailors from the Abyssal Queen." Emily frowned. "What's the Abyssal Queen?" The woman sighed. "A ship that sank 100 years ago. The crew was lost, but their spirits linger. They pull the living into the depths, desperate for company." Emily's stomach churned. "Why hasn't anyone done anything?" "You can't fight the sea," the woman said. "But if you want to survive, you'll need to leave before nightfall." Emily rushed back to the group, urging them to pack up and leave, but Kevin refused. "We're not running from some stupid ghost story," he said, his tone defiant. That night, the whispers began. Faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but growing louder until they filled the air. The group huddled in their tent, terrified. Then the tent collapsed. They scrambled out, only to find themselves surrounded by figures rising from the sand. Their forearms were distorted, their eyes empty voids. The whispers reached for them, their fingers cold and wet. Kevin screamed as one of the figures dragged him toward the water. Emily grabbed his arm, pulling with all her strength, but the figure was stronger. One by one, the others were taken, their cries silenced by the waves. Emily was the last. As the figures closed in, she remembered the old woman's words. "You can't fight the sea." With a final scream, she was pulled under. Days later, a search party found their campsite abandoned and eerily pristine. The locals shook their heads, muttering about the whispers and the folly of ignoring the ocean's warnings. The sterile, fluorescent lights of Westbridge High School flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows across the deserted hallways. The announcement had come over the intercom only minutes ago. Attention, all students and staff. This is a lockdown. This is not a drill. Panic rippled through the classrooms as teachers hurried to lock doors and turn off the lights. Students huddled under desks, their whispers silenced by the weight of unspoken fear. In room 217, Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she clutched her phone, the screen dimmed but active. Messages from classmates flooded in, each one more frantic than the last. "Did you hear that scream?" Someone said they saw a man near the gym. "The doors won't open anymore. We're trapped." Emily's best friend, Mia, sat beside her, her hands trembling as she clutched her knees. "Do you think it's real?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Emily could answer, a loud bang echoed through the halls, followed by a heavy, dragging sound. The entire class froze, their breaths shallow and eyes wide. Mr. Carter, their usually unflappable English teacher, pressed a finger to his lips, motioning for silence. Emily strained to listen, her senses heightened by adrenaline. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just footsteps. It was something heavier, something unnatural. The dragging stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that sent chills racing down her spine. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her hand. She flinched, nearly dropping it. A new message had appeared on the screen. "Don't make a sound. It can hear you." Emily's blood ran cold. The message wasn't from anyone in her contacts. In fact, it had no sender at all. The class sat in oppressive silence, each second stretching into an eternity. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, was out there knew exactly where they were. She glanced at Mia, who had buried her face in her arms, her breathing shallow and erratic. Another thud reverberated through the hallway, closer this time. A few desks away, Jake, the class clown who never took anything seriously, began to shift nervously. He leaned toward the window, peeking through the blinds to catch a glimpse of the corridor outside. "Jake, don't," Emily mouthed, her voice caught in her throat. Too late. The blinds rattled softly as he lifted them. A moment later, his face drained of color. He jerked back, nearly knocking over his chair, and whispered, "There's something out there." Before anyone could respond, the classroom door handle jiggled violently, the sound slicing through the tension like a knife. The room plunged into chaos. Whimpers and stifled cries broke the silence as students clung to each other in terror. Mr. Carter motioned frantically for everyone to stay down, his face pale but determined. The door rattled again, harder this time, as if someone or something was testing its strength. Emily's hands shook as she typed a message to the unknown number. "Who are you? What's out there?" The reply came instantly. "Stay hidden, it's already inside." Emily's eyes widened, her pulse hammering in her ears. She looked around the room, her mind racing. Inside? How? They had locked the doors? Hadn't they? A cold dread settled over her as she realized the truth. The thing outside wasn't the only danger. A faint scraping sound drew her attention to the ceiling. The overhead lights flickered again, casting erratic shadows that seemed to stretch and shift. The sound grew louder, a rhythmic scuttling that echoed above them like nails on metal. The students exchanged terrified glances, their fear palpable. "Emily," Mia whispered, clutching her arm. "What do we do?" Emily didn't have an answer. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but where? The hallway was a death trap, and the classroom felt like a coffin. Another message buzzed onto her phone. "The vents. Don't let it see you." Her gaze snapped to the air vent above the whiteboard. The cover was slightly ajar, a faint trail of dust cascading onto the floor. Her stomach churned as the scuttling grew louder, closer. Whatever was in the ceiling was coming down. The first scream broke the silence like glass shattering. It came from somewhere down the hall. A chilling, guttural cry that made the hairs on Emily's neck stand on end. Jake flinched, his eyes darting between the door and the vent. "This isn't happening," he muttered under his breath. "Everyone, stay calm," Mr. Carter whispered, though his voice betrayed his own fear. He gestured for the students to move farther into the corners of the room, away from the door and windows. Emily's phone buzzed again and she glanced down. "It's hunting. Movement draws it in." She quickly typed back, "What is it? Who are you?" The reply came seconds later. "Survive first. Questions later." Emily's frustration boiled beneath her fear. She wanted answers, but the sound of scratching and scuttling overhead pushed her curiosity aside. Whatever was in the vents was growing restless. A sharp, metallic clang reverberated through the room as the vent cover above them shifted slightly, hanging precariously by a single screw. "It's coming," Mia whimpered, tears streaming down her face. Suddenly, the vent cover crashed to the floor with a deafening clatter. The students recoiled, pressing themselves against the walls. For a moment, nothing happened. The vent gaped open like a black hole, its depths impenetrable in the dim light. Then, a pale, skeletal hand emerged, its fingers impossibly long and tipped with razor-sharp claws. The creature's face followed, grotesque and twisted, with empty black eyes that seemed to suck in the light around them. Emily stifled a scream as the creature's head turned, scanning the room with an unnatural, jerky motion. It sniffed the air, its mouth opening to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. The room was suffocatingly silent, the students too terrified to move. The creature's head snapped toward Jake, who had unknowingly shifted his foot. The faint scrape of his shoe against the tile floor was enough to draw its attention. It let out a guttural hiss and lunged forward, its movements impossibly fast. "Run!" Mr. Carter shouted, throwing a chair at the creature. The impact barely fazed it, but it gave the students a split second to scramble toward the back of the room. Emily grabbed Mia's hand, dragging her toward the emergency exit door. "The hallway isn't safe," Mia cried. "Nowhere is safe." Emily shot back, slamming her shoulder against the door. It creaked open, revealing the dimly lit corridor. The sound of chaos echoed from other classrooms, screams, crashes, and the same inhuman growls they had heard earlier. The two girls bolted down the hallway, their footsteps echoing like gunshots. Behind them, the creature let out a bone-chilling screech, followed by the sound of desks and chairs being overturned. It was chasing them. The alarm blared through the school, a shrill, piercing sound that turned laughter into gasps and footsteps into frantic scurrying. "Lockdown. This is not a drill," the intercom announced, the voice trembling ever so slightly. In room 302, Mrs. Sandoval immediately sprang into action, bolting the door and gesturing for her students to gather in the corner. Phones buzzed in panicked unison as notifications lit up screens. Shots fired near the parking lot. Kayla's heart hammered against her ribcage as she crouched beneath the window, her breathing shallow and uneven. She glanced at her best friend Zoe, who was clutching a pen as if it were a weapon. The classroom was eerily quiet except for the muffled sobs of a few students and the faint rustle of someone shifting nervously. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed down the hall, a door slamming shut, or perhaps being kicked in. The sound reverberated like a gunshot, and the room collectively flinched. Kayla grabbed Zoe's arm, her nails digging in. "What's happening?" she mouthed, but Zoe could only shake her head, her face pale and expressionless. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and far too slow. Whoever it was wanted to be heard. Each step grew louder, closer, as if the hallway itself was amplifying the sound. Kayla's stomach churned as she realized the footsteps weren't accompanied by any voices. No orders to evacuate. No calls for calm, just silence in between the ominous steps. Mrs. Sandoval gestured for absolute silence, her finger pressed firmly against her lips. But Kayla could see the fear in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hand as she clutched a pair of scissors. The footsteps stopped just outside their door. The handle jiggled, once, twice, a third time. Then, nothing. Kayla's phone vibrated in her pocket, the sudden sensation making her jump. She fumbled to silence it, but curiosity got the better of her. She glanced at the screen. "Why are you hiding? It won't help." Her blood turned to ice. The message wasn't from anyone she knew. In fact, there was no sender listed at all. She showed Zoe, who immediately shook her head, mouthing, "Don't reply." But before Kayla could decide, another message appeared. "I'm already inside." Kayla's eyes darted around the room, her breathing ragged. That couldn't be true. It didn't make sense. The door was locked. The windows were shut. Everyone was accounted for, weren't they? She counted the heads in the room. 23. The exact number that should be there. But something felt wrong, a prickle at the back of her neck that refused to go away. Then she noticed it. In the corner of the room behind the filing cabinet, a shadow moved. Slight, almost imperceptible, but enough to send her heart into overdrive. She nudged Zoe and pointed. Zoe squinted, her expression shifting from confusion to horror in an instant. There was someone there, someone who hadn't been there before. The shadow shifted again, and this time a face emerged. Pale, hollow-eyed, and grinning far too wide. Whoever it was raised a finger to their lips, mimicking Mrs. Sandoval's gesture, but there was nothing reassuring about it. It was a warning. Kayla's breathing quickened as the figure stepped forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, almost gliding. The rest of the class hadn't noticed yet, too focused on the locked door and the lingering fear of the footsteps outside. But Kayla knew. This thing wasn't supposed to be here. She grabbed Zoe's wrist, gripping it tightly. "We have to do something," she mouthed, but Zoe's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head. The figure moved closer, its head tilting as if studying the room, and then it vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, dissolving into the shadows as if it had never existed. The classroom door rattled violently, the handle twisting as whoever was outside tried to force their way in. The noise snapped the class out of their daze, and a few students began to cry openly. Mrs. Sandoval held up her hands, trying to calm them, but her own composure was slipping. Kayla's phone buzzed again. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. The new message read, "It's watching you." Her stomach lurched. She turned her gaze back to the corner, but it was empty. The filing cabinet stood innocuously, as if nothing had happened. She wanted to believe it was her imagination, some kind of stress-induced hallucination, but the messages on her phone told a different story. Another bang shook the door, this time harder than before. The wood splintered slightly, and a low, guttural growl seeped through the crack. Whatever was outside wasn't human. Kayla knew it now, deep in her bones. The lights flickered overhead, casting the room into brief, stuttering darkness. When they came back on, a collective gasp filled the room. Written on the whiteboard in jagged, dripping letters was a single word: run. Mrs. Sandoval turned to the students, her face pale and determined. "We're going to move," she whispered. "Quietly. Stay together." The students hesitated, their fear rooting them to the spot, but another deafening crash at the door spurred them into action. Mrs. Sandoval motioned for them to follow her to the emergency exit at the back of the room. Kayla stuck close to Zoe, her pulse racing as they filed out into the dimly lit hallway. The corridor was eerily empty, the silence broken only by the distant echo of crashing doors and faint, inhuman growls. The group moved as one, their footsteps muffled against the tile floor. Kayla's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the figure from the classroom. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was still with them, lurking just out of sight. As they turned a corner, a scream rang out from behind. Kayla whipped around to see one of her classmates, Jake, being dragged into the shadows by something she couldn't fully see. His fingers clawed at the floor, his cries muffled as he disappeared into the darkness. Panic erupted. Students broke formation, some running blindly while others froze in terror. Mrs. Sandoval shouted for them to stay together, but her voice was drowned out by the chaos. Kayla grabbed Zoe's hand and pulled her toward a stairwell. "We have to get out of here," she yelled. "Where?" Zoe cried, tears streaming down her face. "It's everywhere." Kayla didn't have an answer. All she knew was that they couldn't stop moving. Behind them, the growls grew louder, closer, accompanied by the sound of heavy, pounding footsteps. Whatever was hunting them wasn't far behind. The small town of Clearwater was nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and thick forests. Its name came from the pristine lake that reflected the sky like a mirror. Life in Clearwater was simple, predictable, and for the most part, peaceful. But on one fateful summer evening, the peace was shattered as nature unleashed a force that would forever change the lives of its inhabitants. The day had been unusually warm, with a thick, humid air hanging over the town. The birds' songs were muted, and even the usually boisterous children playing by the lake seemed subdued. Old Mr. Hansen, who had lived in Clearwater for over 70 years, sat on his porch and squinted at the horizon. "There's something in the air," he muttered to himself. His weathered hands gripped the armrest of his rocking chair as he watched dark clouds begin to gather far in the distance. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a murky gray, and a strong wind began to rustle the trees. Lizzie, a curious 12-year-old girl with a knack for exploring, had been playing near the forest edge when she noticed the strange behavior of the animals. Birds flew erratically, squirrels darted to their nests, and even the usually vocal frogs near the lake were silent. "Mom," Lizzie called out as she ran back home, her chestnut hair flying behind her. "Something weird is happening." Her mother, busy gathering laundry from the line, glanced up at the ominous sky. "It's just a storm, sweetheart," she said, though her voice carried a hint of unease. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the storm announced its arrival with a low, menacing growl. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the town in brief, eerie flashes. Thunder followed, a deep rumble that seemed to shake the very earth. Families hurried to secure their homes, shutting windows and lighting candles in preparation for what they feared might be a long night. Lizzie, ever the adventurer, begged her parents to let her watch the storm from their porch. Reluctantly they agreed, but only if she stayed close. "It's beautiful," Lizzie whispered as a bolt of lightning split the sky. But her awe quickly turned to fear as the wind howled louder and the rain came down in torrents, drumming against the roof like an army of drums. The storm intensified, with winds reaching speeds that bent trees and ripped shingles from rooftops. The power lines swayed precariously, and soon the town was plunged into darkness. Panic spread as residents struggled to navigate the chaos. The Clearwater River, usually calm and serene, began to swell dangerously. Sheriff Tom Bradley received calls from frantic townsfolk, reporting flooded basements, toppled trees, and even a few missing livestock. He knew this was no ordinary storm. "Everyone, stay indoors," the sheriff announced over the emergency radio frequency. "This is a dangerous situation." Amid the storm, Lizzie couldn't shake the feeling that something more was happening. She peered out the window, her flashlight beam slicing through the rain-soaked night. That's when she saw it. A faint, bluish glow emanating from the forest. "Dad, there's something out there," she exclaimed, tugging at his sleeve. "It's just the lightning, Lizzie," he replied, his voice tense as he focused on securing the house. But Lizzie knew better. Her curiosity got the best of her, and while her parents were distracted, she grabbed her raincoat and boots and slipped out into the night. The rain stung her face as Lizzie made her way toward the forest. The glowing light grew brighter, pulsing rhythmically like a heartbeat. As she approached, she found a large, fallen tree with its roots torn from the ground. Nestled among the roots was a strange, crystalline object emitting the glow. Lizzie reached out, her fingers brushing against the crystal. The moment she touched it, a surge of energy shot through her, and the storm seemed to intensify. Lightning struck closer, and thunder roared louder than ever. "What is this?" Lizzie whispered, clutching the crystal as a sense of both wonder and fear washed over her. Back in Clearwater, the storm showed no signs of relenting. Sheriff Bradley organized a group of volunteers to check on vulnerable residents. Despite the chaos, the community came together, helping one another through the ordeal. Meanwhile, Lizzie's parents discovered she was missing. Panic set in as they braved the storm, calling her name into the roaring wind. "Lizzie," her mother cried, her voice cracking with fear. As Lizzie held the crystal, the storm's ferocity seemed to focus around her. Suddenly, the wind died down and an eerie calm enveloped the forest. Lizzie found herself in the eye of the storm, surrounded by an unnatural stillness. A voice, deep and resonant, filled the air. "Child of Clearwater, you have found the heart of the storm. It is both a blessing and a curse. What will you do with its power?" Lizzie hesitated, her mind racing. She thought of her family, her town, and the destruction the storm had caused. "I just want to protect everyone," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. The voice spoke again. "To wield this power, you must sacrifice something precious. Are you willing to pay the price?" Tears streamed down Lizzie's face as she nodded. "If it means saving my town, yes." The crystal glowed brighter, and Lizzie felt a searing pain in her chest. The storm's energy seemed to flow into her, and she collapsed to the ground with boom. When Lizzie awoke, the storm was gone. The sky was clear, and the first rays of dawn bathed the town in golden light. She stumbled back to Clearwater, clutching the now dull crystal. Her parents found her and embraced her tightly, their relief palpable. "What happened?" her father asked, but Lizzie only shook her head, too exhausted to explain. The town began to rebuild, and though the residents marveled at the storm's sudden end, only Lizzie knew the truth. She kept the crystal hidden, a reminder of the power she had unleashed and the price she had paid to save her home. Years later, Clearwater thrived, its people resilient and united by the memory of that fateful night. Lizzie, now grown, remained the town's quiet protector. Though the storm had long passed, she knew its power still lingered, waiting for the day it might be needed again. The storm arrived with no warning. In the small coastal town of Blackwater Bay, summer storms were as common as the tide. But this storm was different. There were no whispers of it on the radio, no radar images flashing across the news, and no warnings to the townsfolk. It seemed to come from nowhere, rolling in with clouds so dark they swallowed the horizon. It was the kind of storm that didn't just bring rain, but unearthed old secrets better left buried. For Mia Carter, the storm would change everything. The night it descended, she was alone in the family's beach house, an isolated cabin perched on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. What began as a quiet evening turned into a night of terror as the thunder brought more than just lightning and rain. Mia was sipping tea by the window when the first flash of lightning illuminated the ocean. The waves churned violently, crashing against the cliffs with a force that rattled the cabin's windows. She frowned. The sky had been clear just an hour ago, and now it looked like midnight, though it was barely 8 p.m. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from her friend Alex read, "Are you okay? This storm is crazy. Power's already out here." Mia glanced at the lights. They flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of her flashlight app. "Perfect," she muttered, grabbing a few candles from the cupboard. The matches sparked, and soon the soft glow of candlelight filled the room. Outside, the storm intensified, the thunder rolling closer with every passing second. As she lit the last candle, a strange sound reached her ears. It wasn't the wind or the rain, but something deeper, almost like a low hum, a vibration that resonated in her chest. She tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the storm, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a hum, it was a voice. The voice was faint at first, a whisper carried on the wind. Mia froze, straining to listen. It sounded like someone calling her name. "Mia," her heart pounded. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping it across the room. There was no one there, but the voice came again, clearer this time. "Mia, help us." She stumbled backward, her breath quickening. The sound wasn't coming from inside the cabin. It was coming from outside, from the storm. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cliffs outside. For a brief moment, Mia thought she saw figures standing at the edge, their silhouettes stark against the sky. But when the darkness returned, they were gone. She closed the curtains, her hands trembling. "You're imagining things," she told herself. "It's just the storm." But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a living thing. Mia huddled on the couch, clutching her phone as if it could protect her. She tried calling Alex, but the signal was gone. The only sound was the relentless pounding of rain against the windows and the occasional crack of thunder. And then came the knock. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the storm. But it grew louder, more insistent. Mia's stomach turned to ice. No one should have been out in this weather, especially not this far from town. She approached the door slowly, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. No answer. Just the knock, louder this time. Against her better judgment, she unlatched the door and opened it a crack. The wind nearly tore it from her hands, and rain splashed across the floor. Standing on the porch was a man, his face pale and his clothes drenched. His eyes, they were wrong. Too dark, too empty. "Let me in," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Mia slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. The man didn't knock again. Instead, he began to hum, the same low, resonant hum she'd heard earlier. The hum grew louder, filling the cabin until it drowned out the storm. Mia covered her ears, but it was no use. The sound wasn't just external, it was inside her head, vibrating through her skull. She screamed. the sound tearing from her throat as the candles flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped the room, broken only by the sporadic flashes of lightning. And that's when she saw them. Figures moved in the shadows, their shapes barely human. They slithered across the walls, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were everywhere, surrounding her, closing in. "Leave me alone!" she cried, swinging her flashlight wildly. The beam cut through the darkness, and the figures recoiled, hissing like steam escaping a kettle. But they didn't retreat for long. With every flash of lightning, they grew closer, more solid. Mia stumbled into the kitchen, her mind racing. The storm wasn't natural. It wasn't just weather. It was alive, and it had brought these things with it. But why? And what did they want? Her eyes fell on an old journal lying on the counter. It had belonged to her grandfather, who had built the cabin decades ago. She grabbed it, flipping through the pages frantically. Most of it was mundane, fishing logs, weather patterns, but one entry caught her eye. July 15th, 1963. The storm returned last night. I saw them again, the shadows and the lightning. They're getting stronger. If anyone reads this, know that the storm isn't just a storm. It's a doorway, and it's hungry. The word sent a chill down her spine. A doorway? To what? Outside, the thunder cracked so loudly that the walls shook. The hum returned, louder than ever, and with it came the whispers. Mia knew she couldn't stay in the cabin. The storm was drawing her in, breaking her will with every passing second. If she didn't escape now, she never would. Grabbing a lantern and the journal, she bolted for the back door. The rain hit her like a wall, soaking her instantly. She could barely see, but she didn't stop running. She had to get to the cliffs. She didn't know why, but something told her the answers were there. The shadows followed, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. They clawed at her, their touch freezing and burning at the same time. But she kept going, the lantern's light keeping them at bay. When she reached the edge of the cliffs, the storm seemed to pause. The rain stopped, the wind died, and the shadows retreated, hovering just out of reach. In the eerie silence, Mia opened the journal to the final page. The doorway can be closed, but only with light, pure light, the kind that burns away the darkness. She lifted the lantern high, its flame flickering weakly. The shadows hissed, surging forward as the storm roared back to life. With a cry, Mia hurled the lantern into the air. It shattered against the ground, the flame exploding into a blinding light. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into smoke. The storm howled one final time before dissipating, leaving Mia alone on the cliffs, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. The next morning, the sun rose over Blackwater Bay, its light washing away the remnants of the storm. Mia returned to the cabin, exhausted but alive. The journal sat on the table, its pages blank, as if the storm had taken its secrets with it. But Mia knew better. The storm wasn't gone, it was only waiting, and next time, it wouldn't come alone. In the quiet farming town of Willow Creek, thunderclaps were nothing new. Nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills, the town often bore the brunt of summer storms. Yet, there was one storm, the thunder of Hollow Peaks, that no one spoke of without a shiver. Local legend claimed it wasn't just a storm, but a harbinger of things best left buried. A storm that called to the shadows. A storm that returned every 30 years to claim its due. It began, as all storms do, with a change in the air. Ellie Mathers first noticed it while tending to her garden on a late July afternoon. The wind, which had been light and breezy, suddenly dropped. The cicadas that buzzed endlessly in the summer heat fell silent. The clouds were far on the horizon, but something about their slow, deliberate movement toward the town felt off. Ellie's neighbor George leaned over the fence, wiping sweat from his brow. "Storm's coming," he said, his voice uneasy. "Looks like a bad one." Ellie nodded, though she couldn't shake the weight settling on her chest. There was a stillness that didn't feel natural, a silence so thick it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. That night, as the first rumbles of thunder echoed across the valley, Ellie's dog, Max, began to whine. He paced by the front door, his ears flat against his head. When Ellie tried to calm him, he barked sharply at the window, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. By midnight, the storm was in full force. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the town in brief, blinding flashes. Thunder boomed so loudly that houses shook on their foundations. The rain came down in sheets, hammering against roofs and windows with relentless fury. Ellie sat in her living room, a candle flickering on the coffee table as the power had gone out hours before. Max refused to leave her side, growling low at the door. She tried to distract herself with a book, but her eyes kept darting to the windows. Every now and then, she thought she saw something. A flicker of movement in the shadows, just beyond the porch light's reach. Across town, others were noticing strange things too. Old Mrs. Henderson swore she saw figures moving in her backyard. The Johnson twins heard whispers coming from the attic, though they lived alone. And at the Willow Creek Diner, the night cook, Sam, reported that the storm seemed to stop for a moment, just long enough for him to hear footsteps outside, even though no one was there. The next morning, the storm hadn't abated. In fact, it had grown stronger. Lightning no longer struck sporadically, but in steady intervals, each flash illuminating the world in a harsh, unnatural glow. The thunder, too, seemed closer, as if the storm had descended to walk among the town. It was then that Ellie heard the knock. She froze, her heart racing. Max barked furiously, his teeth bared as he lunged at the door. Peering through the peephole, Ellie saw a man standing on her porch, drenched to the bone. His clothes were tattered, his face pale and gaunt. But it was his eyes that stopped her, dark and hollow, like twin voids. "Please," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Let me in. It's coming." Ellie hesitated. Every instinct told her to lock the door and turn away. But the desperation in the man's voice was undeniable. Reluctantly, she opened the door just enough to let him inside. The man collapsed onto the floor, shivering violently. "You shouldn't have let me in," he whispered, his voice cracking. "It follows the storm. It knows I'm here now." As the man warmed himself by the fireplace, he told Ellie his story. His name was Mark, and he had been on the run for days. The storm had started near his hometown, miles away, and it had followed him ever since. "It's not natural," he said, his voice trembling. "It doesn't just bring rain, it brings them, shadows, things that shouldn't exist. They hide in the lightning, in the thunder, and when the storm leaves, so do you." Ellie's stomach turned. "What do you mean, so do you?" Mark looked at her with haunted eyes. "It takes people. My brother was the first. He went outside during the last storm to check the generator. We heard him scream, but when we ran out, he was gone. Just gone. No body, no blood, only his flashlight, lying in the mud." Before Ellie could respond, the whispers began. They started faintly, like the rustling of leaves, but soon grew louder, clearer. Ellie clutched her ears, but the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside her head, crawling through her thoughts like worms. Beside her, Max howled, his hackles raised. Mark stood abruptly. "They're here." Lightning flashed, and for a brief moment, Ellie saw them. Shadows, long and thin, stretching unnaturally across the walls and ceiling. They moved with the lightning, vanishing when darkness returned, only to reappear with the next flash. But they were getting closer. "We have to leave," Mark said, grabbing her arm. "Now." Running into the storm felt like madness, but staying inside was worse. They fled into the downpour, the rain stinging their skin like needles. Max stayed close to Ellie, barking furiously at the shadows that flickered in the corners of her vision. The town was unrecognizable. Streets were flooded, houses dark and lifeless. Figures moved behind windows, their faces pressed against the glass, but they didn't respond to Ellie's cries for help. It was as if the entire town had been swallowed by the storm. Mark led her to the church, its steeple barely visible through the rain. "It's the only place they can't enter," he said. "I don't know why, but it's safe." Inside the church, the whispers ceased. The air was heavy but still, the silence a welcome reprieve from the storm's fury. Mark collapsed onto a pew, breathing heavily. Ellie looked around. The church was empty, save for a single book lying open on the altar. She approached it cautiously, her eyes scanning the faded text. It spoke of an ancient pact, a deal made by the town's founders to ensure prosperity. In exchange, the storm would come once every generation to claim its due. "It's a sacrifice," Mark said from behind her. "The storm doesn't stop until it's taken enough souls." The storm battered the church walls, the shadows pressing against the stained glass windows. Ellie knew they couldn't stay there forever. "There has to be a way to end this," she said, gripping the book tightly. Mark pointed to an illustration in the book, a figure standing beneath the storm, holding a lantern. "The light," he said. "It's the only thing they fear." With no time to lose, they gathered every candle and flashlight they could find. As they stepped back into the storm, Ellie held the lantern high, its beam cutting through the darkness. The shadows recoiled, their whispers turning to screams. There's something about a thunderstorm that always feels alive, as if the sky itself is watching, waiting. For years, the small town of Red Hollow had whispered about a storm that struck once every generation, leaving destruction and madness in its wake. Locals called it the Endless Thunder, a tempest so fierce it was said to steal the souls of those caught within its path. Most dismissed the stories as folklore, but for Amanda, Jake, and Clara, the storm would become all too real. Amanda had always loved storms. There was a beauty in their chaos, a strange comfort in the sound of rain hammering against her window. She'd grown up in Red Hollow, listening to her grandmother's tales of the endless thunder. "It's no ordinary storm," her grandmother had warned. "When the thunder roars and the lightning splits the sky, don't you dare look outside. Close your curtains, lock your doors, and whatever you do, don't listen to the whispers." Amanda always laughed it off, chalking it up to the ramblings of an old woman. But on the night of the first storm, she began to wonder if there was more truth to those tales than she'd ever believed. It was a warm summer evening when the storm rolled in. Amanda, Jake, and Clara had been driving back from a concert in the neighboring city. The highway deserted except for their car. The weather had been perfect earlier, but now the sky churned with ominous gray clouds, and a strange stillness settled over the landscape. "That doesn't look good," Clara said from the back seat, her voice tinged with unease. Jake, who was driving, shrugged. "It's just a summer storm. We'll be fine." But Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The clouds weren't just dark, they were black, and they seemed to pulse, as if alive. A low rumble of thunder echoed across the sky, followed by a flash of lightning so bright it lit up the entire horizon. Then came the rain. It started as a light drizzle but quickly escalated into a torrential downpour. The wipers on Jake's car worked furiously, but they couldn't keep up. The world outside was a blur of water and shadow, and the road disappeared beneath pools of rain. "Maybe we should pull over," Amanda suggested, her voice tight. Jake nodded. "Good idea. I can't see a damn thing." They found a small turnout by the side of the highway and parked beneath the shelter of a large oak tree. The storm raged around them, the sound of rain and thunder so loud it felt like the car might shake apart. As they waited for the storm to pass, Amanda noticed something odd. The rain wasn't just falling. It seemed to be moving against the wind, swirling in patterns that defied logic. And then there was the lightning. It struck with alarming frequency, always in the same spot, a nearby hilltop silhouetted against the stormy sky. "That's weird," Clara murmured, peering out the window. "Lightning's not supposed to hit the same place over and over, is it?" Amanda shook her head. "No, it's not." And then they heard it. A low, rhythmic whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Amanda's blood ran cold as she strained to hear the words. It was a language she didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. A beckoning, an invitation. "Did you hear that?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "It's just the wind," Jake said, though he didn't sound convinced. But Amanda knew better. The whispers weren't the wind. They were something else, something far more sinister. A sudden knock on the car window made them all jump. Outside, a man stood drenched in rain, his clothes plastered to his thin frame. His face was pale and his eyes were wide with fear. "Please," he begged, "you have to help me." "It's coming." Jake rolled down the window a crack. "What's coming?" The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "The storm. It's not just weather. It's alive. It's hunting us." Amanda's heart pounded. "What are you talking about?" Before the man could answer, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the area. For a brief moment, they saw something in the distance. A towering figure, shrouded in shadow, with eyes that burned like fire. The man screamed and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the rain. The figure began to move, its massive form gliding toward them with impossible speed. Jake slammed the car into gear and they sped back onto the highway, the tires skidding on the wet pavement. "What the hell was that?" Clara cried. "I don't know," Jake shouted, his hands gripping the wheel. "But we're not sticking around to find out." Amanda turned to look out the rear window. The figure was still there, keeping pace with the car despite their speed. Lightning flashed again, and she saw its face, a twisted, grotesque mask of hatred and hunger. "It's getting closer," she yelled. Jake pressed the gas pedal to the floor, but the car began to sputter. The engine coughed once, twice, and then died. "No, no, no," Jake muttered, frantically turning the key. But the car wouldn't start. The whispers returned, louder this time, drowning out the sound of the rain. Amanda covered her ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were inside her head, filling her mind with visions of darkness and despair. Desperate, they fled the car and ran into the woods. The rain was blinding, the ground slippery and uneven. Clara stumbled, but Amanda and Jake pulled her to her feet, urging her to keep moving. They came upon a house, its windows dark and its roof sagging under the weight of years. It looked abandoned, but they had no other choice. They burst through the door, slamming it shut behind them. The house was eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet. But at least they were safe, or so they thought. As they explored the house, they found strange symbols carved into the walls, along with old photographs of the same storm dating back over a century. In every photo, the same shadowy figure loomed in the background. "This isn't just a storm," Amanda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a curse." The whispers grew louder, and the house began to shake. The figure appeared outside the window, its fiery eyes burning through the glass. The storm had found them. With no other options, they barricaded themselves in the basement. Jake found an old journal belonging to the house's previous owner, who had written about the storm and the creature it brought. The journal claimed the only way to survive was to face the storm and resist its whispers. "We have to go back out there," Amanda said, her voice steady despite her fear. "If we stay here, we're dead." Reluctantly, they agreed. Thank you for watching Mr. Night Scare, where the darkness always has a story to tell. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more chilling tales. Until next time, stay safe and sleep with one eye open.